So this is typically when I say who will be presenting next, but in this case, it's myself. So I hope that you're not quite sick of my voice yet. I'm going to be presenting on what I do day to day as a clinical research coordinator. So I'm going to get that pulled up and then we'll get started. So I'm going to get started talking about the melanoma clinical trials at the CU Cancer Center, and then the Cancer Clinical Trials Office, and then what specifically I do as a clinical research coordinator. So just overall at the University of Colorado Cancer Center, there are 71 NCI designated cancer centers. Of that, there are 53 comprehensive cancer centers. They demonstrate research and substantial transdisciplinary research, and we are one of them right here in Colorado, and we are the only one within the state of Colorado. The University of Colorado Cancer Center is the only comprehensive one, as I just said, here in Colorado. And we are designed with a multidisciplinary approach in the mind to prevent, diagnose, and treat cancer, as you've heard Christina and Dr. Medina talk about earlier. Within our mission statement, we would like to highlight the innovation and discovery, which leads us to both the CU Center for Rare Melanoma, which we will have speakers presenting on later today, in addition to the Cancer Clinical Trials Office, which is where I work. My presentation will focus primarily on the CCTO and the Cancer Clinical Trials Office. And later in the symposium, we'll hear from Dr. Robinson and Dr. Coots regarding the CU Center for Rare Melanoma. So the Cancer Clinical Trials Office, also known as the CCTO for short, is more than just focusing on melanoma. So on the left-hand side of the screen, you can see all the different disease types that we also work with. I'm not going to read them all out loud to you, but we are a large team and we are housed right outside the hospital. And we work very closely with all the physicians and all of the research teams involved as well. So we are here to support the clinical investigators, as I just said. We are also here to support the regulatory compliance and quality assurance team. We are here to facilitate CU Cancer Center IITs. For those who are not familiar, IITs are investigator initiator trials. So we have a lot of investigators here who work on their own specific trials. We really focus on that here within the Comprehensive Cancer Center. More so, we provide education and support, and this is to patients, this is to our providers, this is with the sponsors. There's a lot of hands in the pot with clinical research, and we all have to have communication at the forefront of our minds. And then we also provide fiscal and operational resources within the CCTO as well. So you may be thinking, after all, what is a clinical trial? So a clinical trial is clinical research involving individuals, people just like us. We are here to discover answers for prevention, diagnosis, and treatment, all encompassing. Furthermore, we have a large role in public health, as Christina mentioned. A lot of the treatments that we work on, a lot of the prevention that we work on is then published within papers. So that's really a tool for our public health to then look at prevention and treatment and other resources for us in total. We work together. So sometimes we work locally, like I said, with IITs, investigator-initiated trials. Sometimes we work together nationally, and there are only clinical trials available within this country in particular. And sometimes there are also global clinical trials as well. So there are many different stepping stones. A clinical trial is here for present and future impact. So we are on the ground learning day to day about the safety and efficacy and what the treatment works for, who it treats for, or who it works for, and all the different side effects that it may or may not present. And we are also looking in the future. We want to find goals for the future. We want to find additional treatments. We want to find a cure overall. So those are our main goals of a clinical trial. So then many of you may have heard phases of a clinical trial. I've had even some of my patients ask me, what are the phases of a clinical trial? Or I see this as phase 2. I see this as phase 3. Can you please go more into depth about that? So I thought I would kind of give a brief overview of the different phases of a clinical trial. So the first phase really looks at treatment, its safety, dose, and side effects. So really we're seeing, is this new drug or treatment safe for our patients, and at what dose is it safe for our patients? So sometimes within phase 1 clinical trials, we look at dose escalation phases you might see. So we might be increasing the dose, doing tests, looking at data and seeing what is safe for the patient, and then possibly moving on to the next phase. And this is about a handful of people. So I would say maybe a few dozen people, just to give an idea of how many people are participating in a phase 1 clinical trial. A phase 2 clinical trial is really here for assessing treatment response and efficacy. So it's a larger group of individuals. We are here for quite a dozen individuals, something like between 20 to 100 individuals or more on a phase 2 clinical trial. This is to determine new treatments' potential efficacy and treatment response, and to see how the new treatment really affects the body and fights the cancer. Then moving on to a phase 3 clinical trial, this is really looking at long-term effectiveness. This is comparing against the standard treatment or the standard gold treatment you might see, or SOC standard of care. They're kind of all used interchangeably. And this may or may not potentially lead to the road to FDA approval, depending on how it does with a phase 3 clinical trial. So a phase 3 clinical trial could be from 100 people to several thousand people, depending on if it is locally, nationally, or globally, like I said. Phase 4 clinical trials are there for long-term safety and benefits of FDA-approved treatment. So phase 4 clinical trials are looking at the post-marketing surveillance of patients. And again, that can be for 100 to several thousand individuals. And then a colleague of mine shared this great mnemonic device. So I wanted to share it with you. It's slightly cheesy, but I thought it was helpful. And you can think to yourself, does a drug or treatment swim? So S, is it safe? And then W, does it work? I, we're looking at the improved treatment compared to the standard treatment. And then does it stay on market? We're looking at post-market efficacy. So looking at those, you can kind of think to yourself, does a drug or a treatment swim? Like I said, it's a little corny, but it's kind of helpful when you're explaining it. So now that you know a little bit more about clinical trials, one might wonder, how do you participate in it? So first and foremost, always speak to your provider about the options. I think my providers would really like me to say that. You should always speak to your medical oncologist and any providers that you work with to see what they would recommend for you. In addition to clinical trials, there are lots of SOC treatments or standard of care treatments. There may or may not be available to each individual patient and their particular circumstance. So things like surgery, radiation, immunotherapy, targeted therapy, chemotherapy, and or clinical trials. And sometimes there is a combination of multiple of the above. So always speak to your provider. And then if clinical trials is an option, they can present that option to you. When choosing a clinical trial, review the clinical trial timeline, review it with your providers, review it with your loved ones, with your caregivers, review it with your clinical research coordinator, like myself. I'll go into more in depth on what we do. Look at the trial timeline. And as Christina mentioned, we all have lives outside of just your treatment and your cancer diagnosis. So we want to be mindful about how much you have to travel, how long the treatment takes, how long you have to be at the facility, and so on and so forth. That goes into understanding what happens during the study. And you should also always ask questions to your provider and study team throughout the clinical trial as well and before participating in it. To get a large idea of what's available, clinicaltrials.gov is a resource that we give to our patients. It will have more information on all the clinical trials available. So you can always go there just as a starting point. So who's a clinical research coordinator and what do they do? Who am I? What do I do? First and foremost, we are there to help. We are the liaison between patients, between investigators, between physicians, providers. We are there to help support you, guide you through the entire clinical trial process. It can seem daunting. There are a lot of hands in the pot and a lot of steps, but we're there to help you guide and make everything go as seamlessly as possible and to answer questions throughout the way. First and foremost, before you go on a clinical trial, a clinical research coordinator will ask you to review an informed consent and then sign it. We are there to sign it with you. We'll go through it with you. Many of us will read all, if not majority, of the clinical trial consent to our patients to make sure that there is understanding of what is going on in the consent and in the clinical trial, and to provide an opportunity to ask questions along the way. We can write down questions and bring it up to the providers if needed, or if there's specifically clinical trial research questions that we can answer those ourselves, but we're really there as a support. And as the height between radiology if needed, radiation if needed. We're there to coordinate care with the sponsors, to look at aggregate data and to really disseminate that information as needed. So the more you can speak with your coordinator face-to-face, through emails, through phone calls, the better communication that there is from patient to coordinator, the better that the entire clinical trial process will go. You let us know your schedule, and then we will work with you to try and get it all figured out. So communication is definitely key, and we appreciate that from all of our kind patients. More, like I said, just communication with healthcare providers and departments. Like I said, we communicate with sponsors and representatives. For those who are not familiar with the term sponsor, it is some of the pharmaceutical labels that you may have heard of. So some of the pharmaceutical labels, we call them sponsors, and we work with their investigational drugs at times. We also work with investigator-initiated trials. And in those cases, we would communicate with the investigator who initiated that trial. And then lastly, we collect and transcribe data. So luckily at our site, we have this wonderful team of data managers. And we could not do our job without them. They tackle all of our data needs, and they're there to really transcribe all the data for you. They work in large scale data locks. And then that helps the sponsor or the investigator initiated trial to then aggregate that data and then to get outcomes and reports from it. So thankful for our data management team. I know that the clinical research coordinators could not do it without them. At other sites, sometimes the clinical research coordinator does both jobs, and they are both the CRC and data coordinator. So each site is slightly different in kind of what our responsibilities hold, but similar. So now I'd like to talk about the timeline of a clinical trial. We talked about the different phases of a clinical trial, how you might participate, and what a clinical trial is. So this is now a brief overview of the timeline of a clinical trial. And then I will go into screening and eligibility, treatment phases, and follow-up phases on the next slides. So signing consent is very important. A patient will need to sign consent before any study activities or assessments can be completed, as I've said. Consent can include mandatory and optional items. Sometimes the consent will have optional biopsies or optional labs, and those truly are optional. And if you do not want to take a part in the optional consent, then you will be able to still take part in the main majority of the study. And then after signing consent is really when the screening and eligibility process begins. So we kind of use those two terms interchangeably here. Screening and eligibility timeframe can change depending on the study. And I'm really just focusing on our melanoma studies here, I should say. Clinical research is a large machine, and there are many different subtypes of disease, and even each cancer center works slightly different. So I'm specifically talking about our melanoma studies here. For the most part, our screening and eligibility timeframe is about 4 weeks or 28 days. That does seem to change here and there. Sometimes it's shorter, sometimes it's longer, but it's about 4 weeks, just generally speaking, with the clinical trials that I have worked on. And within that 28 days or 4 weeks, we are doing all the assessments and procedures that are required for the clinical trial protocol. This may include a biopsy. This typically includes things like CTs and MRIs and other imaging modalities. This includes things like labs. You'll have to see your provider and get vitals done and kind of have a physical exam done. We'll go through your medical history. We'll go through your previous diagnosis and your current diagnosis and your entire oncology history. We are doing all of these to see that we meet eligibility criteria. And then, like I said, we'll review inclusion and exclusion criteria. Inclusion meaning all the things you need to be a part of the clinical trial, and then exclusion criteria meaning things that if you meet exclusion criteria, then you cannot be part of the clinical trial. So that is what we are doing in those 28 days, or about 4 weeks for all of our patients. If you are eligible for the clinical trial after that screening and eligibility period, that's great. We're so excited. We're there for you. We're going to get you started on treatment if it is a treatment clinical trial. Not all clinical trials are treatment focused. Sometimes there's surveillance clinical trials, so that's good to know as well. Here we're going to specifically talk about treatment clinical trials because that is the large breadth of what we work on here on my team. So clinical trials can include one or multiple phases. Sometimes clinical trials will have the same cadence throughout, and a patient will get the same treatment maybe every 3 weeks or every 4 weeks, and this continues on. There are other phases where sometimes you will have an initiation phase of treatment, and that might mean that you have to have a treatment at a quicker cadence. So you have to come maybe weekly or every other day, and that is only for maybe a first couple of cycles or a first couple of weeks, depending on what the clinical trial needs. And then after that, sometimes there is a maintenance period, and that is where the cadence typically slows down, and you would come in maybe every 3 weeks or every 4 weeks from then on after. That is one example. And like I said, in some clinical trial treatment phases, there is just one phase, and it's the same treatment and it's the same cadence throughout. So just being mindful that clinical trials do change on what is really required from the clinical trial team and the protocol. And always have those conversations when you're going through the consent and ask questions as they arise. There's also different forms of administration of treatment. Some might be familiar with just the treatment through an IV. There's also oral treatment, and there can even be intratumoral treatment. So be very familiar that there are different administration of treatments possible, and there might be a combination of some or all. And then we're also looking at safety assessments, as Christina also spoke about in her presentation. Safety assessments there are for the clinical trial to make sure that the patient is safe throughout the entire clinical trial. Sometimes within the treatment phases, there are observation periods that are required, and that is truly for the safety of the patient and for the clinical trial. So it might be required that a patient would have to stay maybe 1 hour or 2 hours or 4 hours after the treatment. And that is just to get additional safety assessments, which may include blood draws, it may include EKGs, it may include echoes, or truly just might be an observational period. So just being mindful of how long you might be able to stay within the center. The treatment phase will end with an end of treatment, and then this will go into the follow-up phases. So just because an individual is completed with a treatment on a clinical trial does not mean that they are done with the clinical trial at whole. Follow-up phases include active and long-term follow-up. We call it here active follow-up, meaning in-person follow-up. So typically I see on a lot of clinical trials is it will be asked for you to come in 30 days after your last treatment, and then again 90 days after your last treatment. Again, this is for safety assessments, things like a physical exam and vitals for the clinic provider will have to be done. And sometimes there are blood draws, sometimes there are EKGs or echoes, just additional assessments that are required. Each clinical trial is slightly different. And then looking into the long-term follow-up treatment or the long-term follow-up that is with for treatment, and then it will include a follow-up phase as well. So what happens when a clinical trial is completed? Data analysis, both qualitative and quantitative analysis are performed. Safety and efficacy and outcomes are discussed as well. Results from clinical trials are often published in peer-reviewed scientific journals, as Christina said earlier. And then if appropriate, they may continue on to the next phase if safety and efficacy metrics are significant. And this may or may not lead to the road to FDA approval. So why are we all here? We are all here to truly make a difference. Clinical trials gain insights and answers about the safety and efficacy or effectiveness of treatments and procedures. We're here to make groundbreaking advancements made through collaborative efforts. Specifically in the CCTO, active trials that we've had within the last three years are 99 clinical trials. I selfishly looked at the last 3 years because I have been here 3 years. I've been here since 2019. So I was also just interested to see how many trials we've had our hands on. And interestingly, since 2019, we've also opened 42 trials since that time. So we're busy bees. The Center of Rare Melanoma does a wonderful job at looking at their own research and development as well. We'll have 2 individual speakers later on who will present data from that. And just recently, there have been 3 new FDA approvals since I have started my journey here at the CCTO and with the Cancer Center. So it's been really amazing to see different treatments become options for a vast, just a vast portion of our population with the 3 different newly FDA approvals. So that is what I wanted to speak about today. And I just wanted to say thank you for your time. After this, we will commence for a break. So feel free to walk around, get some beverages. We'll come back here in about 15 minutes. So if you presentation, thanks so much.